My name is Barbara, and I am 66 years old. As a retired church choir director, I dedicated my life to fostering harmony and bringing spiritual joy to countless souls. For 35 years, I stood before our congregation, guiding voices in praise, creating moments of transcendence through music. I balanced my demanding role with raising 4 children after my husband's unexpected death, sacrificing personal dreams, and over $200,000 in savings for their education and well-being. I believed I had instilled gratitude, familial love, and an understanding of the sacred bonds that unite us. Then a severe pneumonia left me gravely ill for 72 agonizing hours, my desperate calls to my children unanswered. Discharged weak and frightened, I returned home to deafening silence. My 67th birthday passed with only an electronic card from Lisa, my daughter. Mark, my son, coldly told a social worker, "This is on her. She's losing her mind." My grandson Ethan asked with casual cruelty, "Is Grandma dead yet, so we can skip sending a card?" My lifelong sacrifices, my boundless love, my very existence, all utterly negated, dismissed, forgotten by my own children's shocking indifference and their profound lack of humanity. Yet, as despair threatened to consume my soul, a choir director's unwavering belief in harmony ignited a cold fury. What Mark, Lisa, David, Chloe, and Ethan didn't know was my secret, meticulous personal journals detailing their growing emotional distance and a hidden voice recorder that had captured their dismissive phone calls, their empty promises, their breathtaking indifference. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had witnessed their neglect firsthand. This time, their insidious abandonment wouldn't just be exposed. I would reclaim my voice, find profound purpose, and inspire them toward empathy, proving that emotional honesty triumphs over callousness. The phone felt heavy in my trembling hands as I dialed Mark's number. 3 weeks had passed since my pneumonia ordeal, 3 weeks since my lonely birthday, 3 weeks of silence so profound it echoed through my empty house like a funeral dirge. I needed to hear my children's voices to feel some connection to the family I'd poured my life into creating. "Hello, Mom." Mark's voice came through the speaker flat and distracted. I could hear the television in the background, the sound of his normal life continuing without pause for my existence. "Mark, sweetheart, I've been hoping we could talk." I began, my voice catching slightly. "About what happened, about how I'm feeling. I'm struggling, and I need, Mom, you're a warrior." He interrupted, his tone carrying the dismissive patience of someone addressing a bothersome child. "You handled Dad's illness like a champ. You're fine now. We're busy with our careers, our own families. Don't expect us to drop everything every time you have a health scare." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Fine. I'd spent 3 days in the hospital, delirious with fever, crying out for my children who never came. I'd been discharged to an empty house with no one to help me navigate my recovery, no one to ensure I was taking my medications properly. "Mark, I'm not fine," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by hurt and desperation. "I'm lonely. I'm scared. I spent over $200,000 of my own savings, ensuring you and your siblings had everything you needed. I sacrificed my career opportunities, my personal dreams. Can't you spare some time for your mother who gave you everything?" "Here we go with the guilt trip." Mark sighed audibly. "Mom, those were your choices. Your past sacrifices don't entitle you to monopolize our lives now. It's time you moved on. You have no right to expect us to carry the burden of your loneliness. You have no humanity left for our lives." Before I could respond, the line went silent. He'd hung up on me. With shaking fingers, I called Lisa, praying my daughter would show more compassion than her brother. She answered on the 6th ring, her voice hurried and impatient. "Mom, I can't talk right now. Timmy needs me for his soccer practice, and I have a million things to do. What do you need? I need my daughter, I said simply. I need to feel like I matter to someone. Lisa, I'm drowning in this emptiness. Since your father died, since I retired, I feel like I'm disappearing. Mom, you just need to find your own purpose, Lisa replied, her tone echoing Mark's dismissive efficiency. We're busy living our lives. You can't expect us to be your entertainment committee. Stop being so needy. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. I whispered the word, cutting through me like a blade. Lisa, I raised 4 children alone after your father's death. I worked full-time while ensuring you all had music lessons, college educations, emotional support. I've been there for every crisis, every celebration, every moment that mattered to you. And now, when I need you most, I'm being dramatic. I really can't do this right now, Mom. I'll call you later. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like an angry wasp. But the humiliation was just beginning. Within days of our conversations, I began to notice the whispers, the averted gazes, the subtle signs that my private pain had become public knowledge. Brenda Mark's wife had been busy spreading her version of events to our neighbors and former church members. Poor Barbara. I overheard her telling Mrs. Thompson at the grocery store, she's become so desperate for attention since Harold died. Always calling, always complaining. She's becoming a bit unhinged, frankly. Such a financial drain, too, with all those endless phone calls and constant demands for visits. The words were carefully chosen, designed to paint me as a burden, while positioning Brenda and Mark as long-suffering caregivers. The truth, that they rarely called, never visited, and had contributed nothing to my care, was conveniently omitted. The cruelest blow came from my own grandson. Ethan, now 16, had apparently been coached in the family's new narrative about their troublesome grandmother. During Mark's birthday party, an event to which I wasn't invited, Ethan had asked with casual teenage cruelty, "Is Grandma dead yet, so we can skip sending a card?" Chloe, Lisa's 14-year-old daughter, had giggled in response. "Yeah, Grandma's practically a ghost now. She has no life." The words reached me through Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor who'd been horrified by the children's callousness. "Barbara, I can't believe what I heard at the school pickup," she said, her face flushed with indignation. "Those children were talking about you like you were already gone, like you were some burden they were waiting to be rid of." Mark had reinforced this narrative on social media, posting cheerful updates about his family's peaceful, unburdened life. Photos of family gatherings from which I was conspicuously absent, captions about the joy of simplified living and focusing on what truly matters. The subtext was clear. I was what didn't matter, the burden they'd successfully shed. The demands became more unreasonable with each passing week. When I asked for help with basic household tasks, changing light bulbs I could no longer reach, moving furniture that had become too heavy for my aging body, I was told I was strong and resilient and should handle these things myself. When I suggested they contribute financially to some home care assistance, given that I'd spent my entire life savings on their educations and needs, the response was swift and cold. "That was your choice, Mom," Mark said during one particularly painful phone call. "We didn't ask you to spend your money on us. That doesn't create any obligation on our part." Their promises to call became increasingly hollow. "I'll call you soon," became their standard farewell, but soon stretched into weeks, then months. When I called them, I was made to feel like an intruder in their lives, an unwelcome reminder of responsibilities they'd rather forget. The social isolation was methodical and devastating. My Children's Whisper campaign had effectively ostracized me from the community I'd served for decades. Former choir members began to avoid me unsure of how to navigate the family drama they'd heard about. Church events that had once been my refuge became sources of shame as I felt the weight of sympathetic but distant gazes. Mrs. Henderson remained my only reliable human contact, and even that relationship felt precarious. How long before my children's poison reached her too? How long before she also began to see me as the burden, the dramatic old woman who couldn't accept that her usefulness had expired? As I sat in my empty house that evening, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion, I realized that my children hadn't just abandoned me. They'd orchestrated my systematic erasure from their lives while painting themselves as the victims of my unreasonable expectations. But they had made one crucial mistake. They'd forgotten that I was Barbara Williams Church choir director, trained to recognize harmony and discord, skilled at bringing disparate voices together in common purpose. I'd spent decades managing difficult personalities, mediating conflicts, and creating beauty from chaos. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that I had a voice trained to carry, to command attention, to inspire others. That voice had been silenced by grief and loneliness, but it wasn't gone. The symphony of my resistance was about to begin. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail in a thick envelope bearing the letterhead of Jenkins, Richardson and Associates. My hands shook as I read the cold legal language that would strip away the last vestiges of my independence. Mark and Lisa, through their lawyer, Mr. Jenkins, were demanding I sign over all remaining legal rights to my modest home and any small remaining assets. The letter claimed this was necessary for your future care and would provide peace of mind for all parties involved. The language was clinical, professional, designed to make their seizure of my property sound like an act of compassion. But I could read between the lines. They wanted my house, the $400,000 nest egg that represented my final security, and they wanted me gone. The cruelty was breathtaking in its efficiency. Not content with emotional abandonment, they were now moving to financial appropriation, positioning themselves as my protectors, while systematically stripping me of everything I owned. Brenda's social media posts had taken on a more sinister tone in recent weeks. She shared articles about digital vigilance and responsible security measures for elderly relatives, accompanied by subtle comments about protecting family members from their own naivete. The implication was clear. I was a danger to myself, a confused old woman who needed her more competent relatives to make decisions for her. Sometimes love means making hard choices, one of her posts read. Wisdom comes from recognizing when someone you care about can no longer manage their own affairs safely. The comments section, filled with supportive responses from friends and neighbors who had no idea they were endorsing my systematic destruction. You're so wise, Brenda. It takes courage to step in when family members won't help themselves. Barbara is lucky to have such caring children. But it was the overheard phone conversation that finally opened my eyes to the full scope of their betrayal. I'd been napping in my living room when Brenda's voice carried through the thin walls from Mrs. Henderson's backyard, where she was apparently making a private call. The old lady is costing us a fortune, Brenda said, her voice cold and calculating. All this caring is just an excuse for her to demand our time and attention. She's a burden we need to shed, and honestly, I'm tired of pretending otherwise. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, my heart pounding as I strained to hear more. Once her house is sold, we're free, Brenda continued. $400,000 will cover the cheapest facility we can find, and whatever's left over, well, Mark deserves compensation for all the stress she's caused. We just need to get her declared incompetent and move her somewhere where she can't bother us anymore. The chilling clarity of her words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about my care or my safety. This was about profit, about convenience, about disposing of an inconvenient reminder of their obligations. In their minds, I'd already ceased to be a person and had become merely an asset to be liquidated. As I sat there in the gathering darkness, Brenda's words echoing in my mind, a flood of memories crashed over me. Painful, precious memories of sacrifices my children would never know about, could never understand, would never appreciate. The deepest cut was remembering Mark's crisis in 1995. He'd been 18, sensitive, struggling with depression and anxiety that had reached a dangerous crescendo. The suicide attempt had been hushed up, handled discreetly by mental health professionals who understood the stigma that could follow him for life. But what Mark didn't know, what I'd sworn never to tell him, was the price I'd paid to save his future. The National Symphony Orchestra had offered me the position of associate director, a dream job that would have catapulted my career to heights I'd never imagined. The salary alone would have tripled my income, and the prestige would have opened doors I'd spent decades trying to unlock. But Mark needed me. His recovery required intensive, expensive therapy, specialized care that wasn't covered by insurance. More than that, he needed stability, consistency, the reassurance that his mother would be there for him unconditionally. So I'd turned down the symphony position. I'd used over $100,000 of my own savings, money I'd planned to use for my own retirement security, to pay for Mark's treatment. I'd kept his secret, protected his reputation, and ensured that his mental health struggles would never follow him into his adult life. The irony was unbearable, the son I'd sacrificed my career to save was now claiming I was mentally unstable. The boy whose future I'd secured with my own financial ruin was now positioning himself to take what little I had left. When I tried to subtly reference my past sacrifices during our next phone conversation, Mark's response was swift and brutal. "Mom, you're always playing the martyr," he snapped. "Your past choices are your own business. Brenda says you're trying to manipulate us with guilt, and I think she's right. We're not responsible for decisions you made decades ago." Lisa's reaction was equally dismissive. "Honestly, Mom, you're getting quite paranoid," she said during our brief, painful conversation. "We're worried about your mental health. You're trying to twist history to make us look bad. Maybe it's time we considered getting you some professional help." The gaslighting was complete and systematic. Every attempt I made to remind them of my love, my sacrifices, my devotion was reframed as manipulation, paranoia, or mental decline. They were building a case against my competence while positioning themselves as my concerned protectors. But the cruelest blow came from Ethan during what was supposed to be a casual phone call. When I tried to express my hurt at being excluded from family gatherings, my grandson's response was delivered with chilling indifference. "Grandma, you're crazy," he said, his teenage voice carrying the casual cruelty that only children can muster. "Why don't you just die already?" The words hung in the air like poison. This child whose college fund I'd contributed to, whose childhood I'd enriched with music lessons and summer camps, had just wished for my death. And no one corrected him. No one gasped in horror. No one reminded him that he was speaking to his grandmother, the woman who'd loved him since before he was born. The solution they presented was as calculated as everything else they'd done. Mr. Jenkins had drawn up papers for my care plan, which detailed my permanent placement in Willow Creek Manor, a distant government-assigned facility known for its minimal care and restrictive policies. The plan was a masterpiece of exploitation disguised as compassion. My house would be sold, with the proceeds supposedly used to fund my care. But the math didn't add up. Willow Creek Manor's fees would consume my home's value within 5 years, leaving me dependent on Medicaid while my children kept whatever surplus remained. The facility's visitation rules were particularly cruel. Residents were allowed visitors only twice a month for supervised visits of no more than 1 hour. Phone calls were restricted and monitored. It was designed to isolate me completely from my community, my church, my remaining friends. "This is for your own safety, Mom," Mark explained when he presented the plan. "You're becoming confused, forgetful. You need professional supervision. This facility will ensure you get the care you need." But I could see through their lies. This wasn't about my care. It was about my erasure. They wanted me warehoused somewhere I couldn't embarrass them, couldn't make demands on their time, couldn't interfere with their comfortable lives. As I sat alone in my house that night, reading and rereading the legal documents that would strip me of everything I owned, I felt the full weight of my betrayal settling over me like a shroud. My children hadn't just abandoned me. They were actively destroying me while claiming to act in my best interests. But they had made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was just another confused, helpless elderly woman who would go quietly into the night. They'd forgotten that I was Barbara Williams' church choir director, trained to read music, to follow complex scores, to recognize when voices were singing in harmony and when they were creating discord. And what I was hearing from my family was the ugliest discord imaginable, the sound of greed drowning out love, convenience, silencing compassion and selfishness, destroying the sacred bonds that should unite us. It was time to compose a different song. It was time to reclaim my voice and sing my own truth, regardless of who was listening or whether they wanted to hear it. The morning they came for me, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee from the mug Lisa had given me for Mother's Day 5 years ago. It was a beautiful October day, the kind that had always filled me with gratitude for the simple pleasure of being alive. I should have known that something so peaceful couldn't last. The facility van pulled into my driveway at exactly 9 o'clock, followed by Mark's car. No warning, no discussion, no opportunity to say goodbye to the life I'd built over 40 years. They'd timed my discharge from the hospital to coincide with this transfer, ensuring I'd be too weak and disoriented to resist effectively. Mark entered my house with the efficiency of a man executing a business transaction. Behind him came 2 staff members from Willow Creek Manor, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally sympathetic. "It's time, Mom," Mark said, avoiding my eyes as he spoke. "The facility is expecting you, and we need to make this transition as smooth as possible." I looked at these strangers in my home, these people who'd been hired to remove me from the life I'd spent decades creating. "I haven't agreed to this," I said, my voice weak but determined. "This is my home. These are my choices to make. Your signature isn't required," one of the staff members explained gently. "Your family has medical power of attorney due to your recent health crisis. We're here to ensure your safety and well-being." But I'd never signed any power of attorney. I'd never agreed to any of this. Yet here they were moving through my home like an efficient machine, boxing up my belongings with the casual indifference of professional movers. They deemed my choir robes unsuitable for facility life and sent them to storage. My collection of sheet music, accumulated over 40 years of directing choirs, was too bulky and would be donated. My personal journals, filled with decades of memories and reflections, were considered non-essential and destined for disposal. "Mark, please," I called out as my son supervised the systematic dismantling of my life. "Don't let them do this," This is my home. These things have meaning. They're part of who I am. But Mark's face remained impassive, his voice coldly professional. Mom, you're going to a place where you'll be properly cared for. These material possessions will just clutter your new space. It's better to start fresh. They stripped me of my clothing and gave me facility-issued garments, shapeless institutional gray that drained the color from my face and made me look like the patient they were determined to make me. The transformation was immediate and devastating. I was no longer Barbara Williams' accomplished musician and devoted mother. I was a resident, a case number, a problem to be managed. As they wheeled me toward the van in a wheelchair I didn't need, I caught sight of Mrs. Henderson standing on her front porch. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she watched my forced departure. I tried to call out to her to wave, to somehow communicate that this wasn't my choice, but I was too weak, and Mark deliberately positioned himself to block her view. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mom," he said quietly. "This is for your own good." In that moment, I fully understood the irreversible nature of my children's abandonment. They weren't just sending me away. They were erasing me, removing every trace of my existence from their lives. My voice, which had guided countless choirs in harmony, would be silenced forever in a place where no one knew my name or cared about my story. The ride to Willow Creek Manor was a blur of unfamiliar highway and devastating silence. When we arrived, the facility was exactly what I'd feared: institutional, sterile, designed for efficiency rather than human dignity. My room was small, with a narrow bed, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. Mark's farewell was brief and businesslike. "The staff will take good care of you, Mom. Try to make the best of it." He left without looking back, without a hug, without any acknowledgement that he was abandoning his mother to die among strangers. Later that evening, as I sat on my narrow bed in my gray institutional clothing, staring out at the empty parking lot, my phone buzzed with a text message that would haunt me forever. Mark had sent it to Mrs. Henderson, but she'd forwarded it to me. "Mom is settled. Our family requires no further contact. She's a burden we finally shed." The cold finality of those words, "a burden we finally shed," revealed the truth of how my children saw me. Not as their mother, not as the woman who'd sacrificed everything for their happiness, but as an obstacle to their comfort that had finally been removed. Brenda's social media posts that evening completed my humiliation. Photos of their new, simplified life showed off the expensive renovations they'd made to their home using the proceeds from my house sale. A new kitchen, a luxury vacation, a brand new car, all purchased with the $400,000 they'd stolen from me under the guise of paying for my care. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices for the people you love," Brenda had written. "But the peace that comes from doing the right thing is invaluable." The comments poured in from friends and neighbors who had no idea they were congratulating my destroyers. "You're so wise. It takes real strength to make those tough decisions. Barbara is so lucky to have such caring children." That night alone in my sterile room, with only the sound of medical equipment and distant voices in the hallway, I broke down completely. The tears came in waves, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. I'd lost everything: my home, my possessions, my independence, my dignity. But more than that, I'd lost the illusion that my children loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. And that's when the most painful memory of all surfaced, the secret I'd carried for over 20 years. After Harold died, I'd been alone for 3 years when I met James Patterson, a renowned conductor who shared my passion for music. We'd met at a regional choir festival, and the connection was immediate and profound. James was brilliant, kind, and deeply committed to the same musical principles that had guided my career. James offered me something I'd never expected to find again: love. Not the desperate, needy love of youth, but the mature, companionate love of two people who'd lived full lives and found in each other a perfect complement. He wanted to marry me, to combine our musical careers, to travel the world, conducting orchestras and choirs together. For 8 months, I allowed myself to dream of that future. I imagined waking up next to someone who understood my work, who shared my values, who could be my partner in every sense of the word. I imagined the concerts we'd conduct together, the students we'd teach, the musical legacy we could create. But Lisa, then in her early 20s, couldn't handle the idea of her mother with another man. "I can't cope with another loss, Mom," she'd said through her tears. "I need you here, just you. I'm not ready for a stepfather. I need stability, not more change." So I made the choice I'd made 1,000 times before I chose my child over myself. I ended things with James, told him I wasn't ready for a relationship, and watched him walk away from what could have been 23 years of happiness, companionship, and shared purpose. I gave up love. I gave up partnership. I gave up the chance for a completely different kind of life, one where I would have been valued, respected, and cherished. I made that sacrifice for Lisa's emotional well-being, just as I'd made so many others. And now, as I lay in that narrow bed in Willow Creek Manor, I realized that my sacrifice had been meaningless. The daughter I'd protected was the same woman who'd orchestrated my imprisonment. The emotional stability I'd preserved at such cost to myself had not made her a better person. It had simply enabled her to become a more efficient predator. The cosmic irony was almost too much to bear. I'd spent my career creating harmony, bringing voices together in perfect unity. But my own family had created nothing but discord, using my love as a weapon against me, my sacrifices as justification for their cruelty. As dawn broke over the parking lot outside my window, I made a decision. I was Barbara Williams' church choir director, and I had never backed down from a discordant note that needed to be corrected. This time, the discord was coming from my own family, and the correction would require everything I had left. They thought they'd silenced my voice forever. They thought they'd won, but they'd forgotten that a true musician never stops fighting for harmony, never accepts discord as the final note. My symphony of resistance was about to begin, and this time I would be conducting the performance of my lifetime. Life at Willow Creek Manor was a daily exercise in systematic dehumanization. The facility operated with the cold efficiency of a warehouse where human beings were processed, stored, and forgotten. I was no longer Barbara Williams, accomplished musician and devoted mother. I was resident 247 room 18B, a problem to be managed with minimal effort and maximum profit. My call light became an instrument of torture. I would press it when the pain in my joints became unbearable, when I needed help reaching the bathroom, when the bed sores that had developed from lying in one position too long began to bleed. The light would blink red for hours, while overworked, underpaid staff members ignored my pleas for help. "Can't you see we're busy?" a nurse's aide snapped when I finally managed to stumble to the hallway, clutching the wall for support. "You're not the only resident here. Learn some patience." The medication schedule was a cruel joke. My pain pills prescribed for the arthritis that had worsened since my forced confinement were routinely delayed by hours. "We'll get to you when we get to you," became the standard response when I asked about my medication. The excruciating wait between doses left me curled in my narrow bed, tears streaming down my face as waves of agony crashed over me. My hygiene became another casualty of the facility's indifference. Baths were scheduled once a week, if I was lucky twice a month, if the staff was particularly overwhelmed. The bed sores that developed from lying on cheap institutional mattresses went untreated until they became infected, adding fever and nausea to my growing list of torments. Meals arrived cold, unappetizing, and often hours late. The food bore no resemblance to nourishment: gray meat of uncertain origin, vegetables boiled to mush bread that crumbled at the touch. I lost 30 pounds in the first 2 months, my clothes hanging loose on my shrinking frame. The worst part was the casual cruelty of the staff's conversations, conducted as if the residents were deaf or too senile to understand. This one's family dumped her and never visits, I heard one aide tell another as she roughly changed my bed sheets. Happens all the time. Kids get tired of dealing with their parents and warehouse them here. At least the family pays the bills. Some of them don't even do that. But my physical suffering paled in comparison to the psychological torture of watching my life's work being systematically erased. Through Mrs. Henderson, who managed to visit me twice before the facility restricted her access, I learned that Mark and Lisa had sold our family home within weeks of my imprisonment. Brenda's social media posts documented the destruction with gleeful efficiency. Photos of the renovated modern property showed every trace of my presence being obliterated. The music room, where I'd practiced for decades, had been converted into a home theater. The garden where I'd grown flowers for the church altar was now a concrete patio with outdoor furniture. Most devastating of all, my collection of antique sheet music, some pieces dating back over a century, irreplaceable arrangements I'd spent decades collecting, had been donated to the local high school. "These old hymns are so outdated," Brenda had written in her post. "We're sure the kids will find some use for them, maybe in a history project." The casual dismissal of my life's passion, the reduction of my artistic legacy to outdated curiosities, felt like watching my soul being fed into a shredder. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. 3 months into my confinement, Mrs. Henderson managed to smuggle me a newspaper clipping that made my heart stop. Mark and Brenda had arranged for Ethan and Chloe to participate in a widely publicized seniors awareness campaign at their school. The photo showed my grandchildren holding up drawings of sad grandmas and speaking to a reporter about the importance of caring for our elderly. But the subtext was devastating. They spoke about their own difficult situation, with Grandma Barbara describing me as fragile and confused. Sometimes elderly people get ideas that aren't based in reality. Ethan had told the reporter, his 16-year-old voice carrying the rehearsed wisdom of someone much older. They might think their families don't care about them, when really we're doing everything we can to keep them safe. Chloe had held up a photo of me looking disoriented, clearly taken during one of my weakest moments at the facility, and spoken about the challenges families face when difficult decisions have to be made. "We love our grandmother," she'd said with the practiced sincerity of a young politician. "But sometimes love means making hard choices for people who can't make them for themselves." The local media had eaten it up. Here were two articulate, compassionate young people speaking about the difficult realities of elder care. The reporter had praised their maturity and wisdom in dealing with such a challenging family situation. Reading those words, seeing my own grandchildren publicly portray me as a burden they'd nobly shouldered, felt like being stabbed in the heart repeatedly. These children I'd loved, whose Christmas mornings I'd made magical, whose school concerts I'd never missed, had been weaponized against me with surgical precision. The legal pressure intensified as my physical condition deteriorated. Mr. Jenkins, the social services investigator who'd become completely compliant with Mark and Lisa's wishes, arrived with documents that would strip me of my final rights. "Mrs. Williams, you need to sign this release," he explained, spreading papers across the tiny table in my room. "It's a formal relinquishment of all claims to your past assets and the proceeds from your home sale. Your family has been generous in covering your care costs, but they need legal protection from any future claims." The document was a masterpiece of legal manipulation designed to make my children's theft appear legitimate while threatening my survival if I refused to comply. "If you don't sign this," Mr. Jenkins warned, "your family may not be able to continue funding your care here. We wouldn't want you to lose your place in this facility." The stress of the legal pressure combined with the facility's systematic neglect was destroying my body as efficiently as it was crushing my spirit. My blood pressure spiked dangerously high. My weight loss accelerated. My hands developed a tremor that made simple tasks nearly impossible. To outside observers, I appeared exactly as my children had portrayed me, a confused, fragile elderly woman whose family had made the difficult but necessary decision to place her in professional care. The worse my condition became, the more justified their actions appeared. But in my darkest moment, when I felt myself disappearing entirely into the gray institutional landscape of Willow Creek Manor, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been fighting the facility's visiting restrictions for weeks, managed to slip past the front desk during a shift change. She found me in my room staring out the window at the parking lot, barely recognizing the broken woman I'd become. Without a word, she pressed something into my hands, a piece of worn sheet music from How Great Thou Art, the hymn that had been my favorite to conduct. "I found this in your old music room before they cleaned it out," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "I thought you should have it." As my fingers traced the familiar notes, the melody filled my mind for the first time in months. The harmonies I'd spent decades perfecting, the voices I'd guided in praise, the transcendent moments when music had lifted both performer and audience towards something greater than themselves. This tangible link to my lifelong passion, this small piece of the woman I'd been before my children destroyed me, ignited something I thought was gone forever, the desire to fight. I was Barbara Williams' church choir director. I'd spent 40 years creating harmony from chaos, bringing disparate voices together in perfect unity. I'd guided countless choirs through complex pieces that seemed impossible until they found their rhythm. My children had created discord, but I knew something they'd forgotten. Every discordant note could be resolved if you understood the proper harmonies. Every broken song could be repaired if you had the skill and the will to conduct it properly. They thought they'd silenced my voice forever, but they'd forgotten that a true conductor never stops fighting for the perfect performance, never accepts a broken harmony as the final word. My symphony of resistance was about to begin, and this time I would be conducting with everything I had left. The invitation that would complete my professional destruction arrived at Willow Creek Manor in a manila envelope marked Media Materials. A staff member, thinking it was some kind of mistake, nearly threw it away before I convinced her to let me see it. National Conference on Modern Worship and Community Engagement, the glossy brochure announced. And there listed as the keynote speaker was Mark Williams, visionary church leader and worship innovation expert. My son was going to speak at a national conference about church music. My son, who couldn't carry a tune if his life depended on it, who'd spent his childhood complaining about having to attend choir practice. I stared at the promotional materials, my hands shaking, as I read the description of Mark's presentation, from traditional to transformational, modernizing spiritual practice for new generations. The abstract described how Mark had courageously transformed our church's outdated musical program into a dynamic, contemporary ministry that reaches today's worshipers. He was going to use our church choir, the program I'd built from nothing over 20 years, as an example of everything wrong with traditional worship. He was going to present the destruction of my life's work as a success story. The conference was being held at the Grand Convention Center, the same venue where I'd received the Regional Church Music Directors Award just 5 years earlier, the same stage where I'd been honored for my innovative approaches to traditional hymnody and my exceptional ability to blend classical and contemporary elements. Now my son was going to take my place at that podium using my professional vocabulary to justify the erasure of everything I'd accomplished. A sympathetic staff member at Willow Creek Manor helped me access the conference's live stream on her tablet. I sat in my wheelchair in the corner of the common room, wearing headphones so I wouldn't disturb the other residents, watching my professional legacy being systematically dismantled. Mark took the stage wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his confidence radiating through the screen. Behind him, a large display showed a slide titled Case Study When Tradition Becomes Stagnation. Sometimes, Mark began his voice, carrying the authority of someone who'd studied my own methods and twisted them to his purpose. Spiritual communities become trapped by outdated practices that no longer serve their congregations. My mother, a longtime church choir director, had created what she believed was a perfect musical program, but perfection can become a prison. He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about declining church attendance and the need for relevant contemporary worship experiences. The traditional choral arrangements my mother favored were beautiful in their time, but they created barriers for new members. Her methods fostered emotional dependency rather than spiritual growth. Every word was a carefully crafted lie built on a foundation of my own expertise. Mark was using my terminology, my concepts, my understanding of church music to justify his destruction of the program I'd spent decades building. The audience was captivated. Here was a son who'd had the courage to modernize his family's church despite his mother's resistance. Here was a visionary who'd overcome the obstacles of traditional thinking to create something new and relevant. My mother's approach to choir direction was based on control rather than collaboration, Mark continued. She insisted on perfect harmonies, traditional arrangements, and rigid rehearsal schedules that left no room for spontaneity or individual expression. The irony was staggering. I'd spent 20 years teaching singers to blend their voices, to support each other, to create something beautiful together. Now my son was presenting that collaborative effort as authoritarian control. Brenda appeared on screen for a panel discussion on family dynamics in church leadership transitions. She looked poised and professional, the perfect image of a supportive wife who'd helped her husband overcome family dysfunction. It wasn't easy watching Mark struggle with his mother's resistance to change. Brenda said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. She had such beautiful intentions, but her inability to adapt was creating division in our church community. Mark showed incredible courage in choosing the congregation's needs over family loyalty. The audience gave them a standing ovation. I watched through tears as my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd stolen my home and destroyed my reputation, was celebrated as a victim of my inflexibility. The most devastating moment came when they showed a pre-recorded video message from Ethan. My 16-year-old grandson looked directly into the camera, his face serious and mature. I've learned that worship should be joyful and accessible, not rigid and intimidating, he said. My grandmother's traditional approach made church feel like a performance instead of a celebration. I'm grateful for my dad's vision in creating worship experiences that actually speak to young people. The words were clearly scripted, probably rehearsed dozens of times, but they came from my grandson's mouth. The boy I'd taught to appreciate music, whose voice I'd nurtured through its adolescent changes, was now publicly endorsing the destruction of everything I'd taught him. Then came Chloe's contribution, a video clip that made the audience laugh and nod knowingly. My 14-year-old granddaughter was shown holding up one of my old hymnals, giggling as she said, "Grandma used to direct music from this ancient book, so old-fashioned. We prefer digital worship that actually connects with our generation." The audience laughed at the generational divide, at the old-fashioned grandmother clinging to obsolete methods, while her progressive family embraced new approaches to spiritual expression. My life's work was being presented as a cautionary tale of artistic stagnation and professional arrogance. As the conference concluded with Mark receiving an award for innovation in worship leadership, I sat in that wheelchair feeling like I'd watched my own funeral. My professional reputation, built over 40 years of dedicated service, had been systematically destroyed by people who'd stolen my money, my family, and now my legacy. But as I prepared to wheel myself back to my room, the staff member who'd helped me watch the stream touched my shoulder gently. "Mrs. Williams," she said quietly, "there's someone here who wants to speak with you." I looked up to see Eleanor Patterson, my former assistant choir director and one of my oldest friends. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes bright with the kind of righteous fury I hadn't seen in months. "Barbara," she said, kneeling beside my wheelchair, "I've been watching that conference and I've been investigating what your family has done to you. What Mark is claiming about your choir direction is complete fiction. I have recordings of our rehearsals, letters from choir members, documentation of everything you actually accomplished." For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. Eleanor had found proof of what I'd known all along. Mark's presentation was built on lies, distortions, and stolen expertise. "They think they've won," Eleanor continued, "but they've made one crucial mistake. They've been so focused on destroying your reputation that they've created a trail of evidence that will expose their entire scheme." As I looked at my friend, at the documents she'd brought, at the proof of my actual professional accomplishments, laid bare in black and white, I realized that my musical training hadn't failed me. I'd been so overwhelmed by my personal trauma that I'd forgotten my expertise as a conductor and teacher. I was Barbara Williams' church choir director, and I'd spent 40 years learning to recognize when voices were in harmony and when they were creating discord. Now, it was time to use that knowledge to conduct the performance of my lifetime. The lawsuit papers arrived at Willow Creek Manor on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be serving legal documents to a woman in a wheelchair wearing institutional pajamas. The letterhead was imposing, "Jenkins, Morrison and Associates," and the document was thick, official, and devastating. Mark was suing me for $1 million. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal manipulation, claiming that my harassment and defamation had caused him severe emotional distress and irreparable damage to his professional reputation. It alleged that my persistent attempts to interfere with his church leadership constituted stalking, and that my false accusations about family financial matters had damaged his ability to serve his congregation effectively. Every claim was a twisted version of reality. My attempts to maintain contact with my family became harassment. My efforts to understand what had happened to my life savings became defamation. my fight for basic human dignity became stalking. The legal system was being weaponized against me by people who understood exactly how to manipulate it. But Mark wasn't finished with his systematic destruction of my life. Within days of filing the lawsuit, he began a coordinated campaign to eliminate what little financial security I had left. He contacted my former church's board of directors with fabricated concerns about my mental competence and inappropriate behavior during my tenure. The accusations were vague, but damaging claims that I'd shown favoritism in choir selection, that I'd been financially irresponsible with church music budgets, that my increasingly erratic behavior had created liability concerns for the congregation. Dr. Harrison, a psychiatrist who'd never examined me, but who'd been paid to write a report based on Mark's descriptions of my paranoid delusions, provided professional testimony about my alleged incompetence. The church board, terrified of potential lawsuits and lacking any way to verify Mark's claims, voted to revoke my pension and remove my name from their Hall of Honor. 40 years of faithful service, hundreds of successful concerts, thousands of hours of volunteer work, and it was all erased by lies and fear. The pension that was supposed to provide my basic needs for the rest of my life was gone, stolen through legal manipulation disguised as protective action. My retirement fund administrators received similar calls. Mark claimed I'd been making erratic financial decisions and expressing confusion about my accounts. He provided them with legal documents suggesting I was incompetent to manage my own finances, documents that had been prepared using carefully edited excerpts from my desperate attempts to understand how my family had stolen my home. Within 10 weeks, I was completely destitute. The lawsuit had consumed what little money I could access through the facility's restricted account system. My pension was gone. My retirement funds were frozen, pending a competency evaluation that would be decided by Mark's hand-picked psychiatrist. The final humiliation came when Willow Creek Manor informed me that my family funding had been discontinued due to my legal troubles. Without any source of payment, I couldn't remain in even this minimal level of care. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams," the facility director said, her voice professionally sympathetic. "Your family has indicated they can no longer support your residency here due to your ongoing legal difficulties. We'll need to transfer you to county care within 72 hours. County care meant the streets. At 66 years old, disabled by months of institutional neglect and systematic abuse, I was being cast out to die among strangers. Mark and Lisa had already made their position clear in statements to the local newspaper. We have no legal or moral obligation to support someone who has consistently made false accusations against our family," Mark was quoted as saying. "Our mother's choices have consequences, and we won't enable her destructive behavior by continuing to fund her care." Lisa's response was even more cutting. She posted on social media, "Some people create their own problems and then expect others to fix them. I have my own family to worry about. Prayers for wisdom and peace for everyone involved." The message was clear. I was on my own, abandoned by the children I'd raised, left to die on the streets by people who claimed their actions were motivated by love. But Mark and Brenda weren't content with just destroying me. They wanted to celebrate their victory, to display their spoils, to show the world what they'd accomplished with my stolen legacy. 6 months after my eviction from the facility, Brenda posted photos on social media of their new home recording studio, a luxury edition that had cost over $150,000. The space featured professional-grade equipment, acoustic panels, and a library of digital music resources. "So grateful to dedicate this beautiful space to Mark's visionary work in worship leadership, she wrote, "This studio represents his talent and foresight in managing our family's musical legacy. His mother would be proud of the impact he's having on contemporary worship. She'd used my stolen life savings to build a monument to Mark's destruction of my career. The recording studio was a shrine to my professional death, built with the money I'd saved through decades of modest living and careful planning. The photos were shared widely, with comments pouring in from church members and colleagues praising Mark's success and vision." What a beautiful tribute to musical ministry. So inspiring to see someone turn passion into action. This is what real worship leadership looks like. No one asked where the money had come from. No one questioned how a church employee could afford such luxury. No one wondered about the mother who disappeared from his life just as his fortune had improved. The stress of my situation was destroying what remained of my health. I'd lost 50 pounds since being forced from my home. My blood pressure was dangerously elevated, and I was developing a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. I was living in a downtown homeless shelter, sharing a dormitory with women decades younger than me, surviving on one meal a day from the soup kitchen. Then one night, sleeping on a cot surrounded by strangers, I collapsed. The stroke was severe, what doctors called a major cerebrovascular event. I was rushed to the county hospital emergency room, where machines kept me alive while my body fought to survive. For 6 days, I drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure whether I wanted to wake up or simply slip away into peace. But in those fevered dreams, I remembered something that had been buried for over 20 years. I was back in my bedroom in 1998, watching my husband Arthur count out bills with shaking hands, his face drawn with shame and terror. "Barbara," he'd whispered, "I've lost everything. $30,000 in gambling debts. The church can't know. They'll dismiss me, destroy my reputation. I'm scared, Barbara. I'm so scared." I'd helped him that night using my own savings to pay his debts, my connections to find him treatment, my influence to ensure his gambling problem remained secret. I'd spent over $100,000 of my carefully hoarded money to protect Arthur's reputation and our family's standing in the community. The dream was so vivid that I could smell the coffee we'd been drinking, feel the weight of those bills in my hands. And I realized with startling clarity that my entire adult life had been spent protecting other people's secrets while sacrificing my own security and happiness. I'd protected Arthur's reputation with my money. I'd protected Mark's mental health with my career. I'd protected Lisa's emotional stability with my love life. And now those same people were using my sacrifices as weapons against me, confident that I was too broken to fight back. But as I lay in that hospital bed, barely alive, but finally awake, I understood that my lifetime of sacrifice hadn't failed me. I'd been so overwhelmed by my betrayal that I'd forgotten my greatest strength. I knew how to endure, how to persist, how to find harmony, even in the midst of chaos. Mark and Brenda had made one crucial mistake. They'd forgotten that I was Barbara Williams' church choir director, trained to bring order from confusion, skilled at making beautiful music from discordant voices. The performance wasn't over. In fact, the final movement was just beginning, and this time I would be conducting with everything I had left. From my hospital bed, still weak from the stroke, but driven by a clarity that burned brighter than my physical pain, I knew I had one chance to reach my son. The recovered memory of Arthur's gambling crisis had given me insight into the patterns that had shaped our family, and I needed Mark to understand what his choices were really costing us all. My nurse Jennifer was a kind woman in her 50s who'd been moved by my story. Mrs. Williams she said quietly during her night shift. "I've seen families destroy each other over money and pride, but what they're doing to you is different. This is systematic. This is abuse." I asked Jennifer to help me record a video message on her phone. I wanted to speak directly to Mark, to bypass Brenda's influence, to appeal to whatever remained of the boy I'd raised. "Mark." I began looking directly into the camera, my voice hoarse but determined. "I need you to hear this from me, not filtered through anyone else. I want you to understand what's happening to our family, to recognize the patterns that are destroying us." I told him about the painful memories that had surfaced during my medical crisis, the way his father's gambling addiction had nearly destroyed our family decades earlier. I played the audio recordings I'd made during those dismissive phone calls months ago, capturing his and Lisa's callous remarks about my illness and their plans for my property. "Listen to your own voice," I said, playing back his words. "Listen to how you talk about your mother when you think no one else is listening. She's a burden we need to shed. She has no humanity left for our lives. These aren't the words of love, Mark. This is the language of abandonment." I spoke about the sacrifices I'd made for him, not to guilt him, but to help him understand the depth of my devotion. I mentioned Arthur's hidden struggles, the pattern of family secrets and financial crises that seem to repeat across generations. "I protected your father from the consequences of his gambling addiction," I said. "I used my own savings to pay his debts, my own reputation to shield him from scandal. But I won't protect you from the truth anymore. Your actions are following the same destructive pattern, and you're using my love as a weapon against me." I spoke for 25 minutes, laying bare the full scope of their betrayal, while also acknowledging my deep love for my children. I admitted my mistakes, my enabling behaviors, my role in keeping secrets that had ultimately harmed our family. "This is my final plea," I concluded. "Not as your victim, but as your mother. I'm asking you to remember who you were before this greed consumed you. I'm asking you to choose truth over profit, compassion over convenience, love over money." Jennifer promised to send the video directly to Mark's phone, and I felt a fragile hope that maybe finally my son would see what he'd become and choose to be better. But I'd underestimated Brenda's surveillance network at the hospital. She'd been paying staff members to monitor my communications, and she intercepted the video before Mark ever saw it. What happened next was a masterpiece of digital manipulation that would have been brilliant if it hadn't been so evil. Brenda took my raw emotional plea and transformed it into something sinister. She used editing software to alter the audio, making my voice sound confused and rambling. She spliced sentences together to create statements I'd never made, particularly around my references to Arthur's gambling problems. Most cruelly, she edited my discussion of Arthur's hidden addiction to make it sound like I was threatening to expose fictional crimes. My plea for Mark to remember who you were before this greed consumed you became remember what you did. My mention of protecting your father from the consequences of his gambling addiction became I know what your father really did. The doctored video was a work of art in its malicious creativity. It portrayed me as a dying woman making paranoid accusations, a delusional patient trying to blackmail her own family, a bitter mother inventing stories to destroy her son's reputation. Brenda sold the manipulated video to National Health Watch, a gossip program that specialized in sensational family drama. They aired it as an exclusive expose, dying mother's shocking threats against devoted son. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours, The video had been shared millions of times across social media. Comments poured in almost universally condemning me as a manipulative, mentally ill woman trying to destroy my family's happiness. This is exactly why families need to set boundaries with toxic elderly relatives. One comment read, "Some seniors will say anything to get attention and money." "She sounds completely delusional," said another. "Thank God her son is strong enough to protect his family from this manipulation." "Mental illness in the elderly is so tragic," added a third. "But that doesn't excuse trying to destroy your own children's lives with false accusations." Mark's response was swift and professionally managed. He appeared on the same Health Watch program, his face drawn with carefully practiced grief, his voice trembling with emotion. "This breaks my heart," he said, dabbing at his eyes with a tissue that seemed to appear at exactly the right moment. "My mother has been struggling with paranoid delusions since her stroke. We've tried everything to help her, but she's convinced that everyone is against her. Now she's making these terrible accusations about my deceased father, trying to rewrite our family history." The interviewer's questions were sympathetic, designed to paint Mark as the long-suffering son of a mentally ill mother. "How do you cope with these attacks on your character and your father's memory?" "I just try to remember that this isn't really my mother talking," Mark replied, his voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "This is her illness. The woman who raised me was loving and generous. This person making these accusations is someone I don't recognize." He brought Ethan on camera, my grandson, now 17, and poised in front of the cameras like a seasoned performer. "I love my grandmother," Ethan said, his voice steady and mature. "But her illness has changed her completely. She's not the woman who helped raise me. We just want her to get the help she needs so she can find some peace." The interviewer asked about my claims regarding Arthur's gambling problems, and Mark's response was devastating in its calculated vulnerability. "My mother is trying to weaponize my father's struggle with depression during his final years," he said. "Yes, Dad had some financial difficulties before he died. Many people do. But to suggest that there was some conspiracy, some cover-up, is both cruel and dangerous. It dishonors his memory and perpetuates harmful stigmas about mental health. He'd turned my protection of our family's secrets into my victimization of his father's memory. He'd transformed my sacrifices into my manipulation. He'd made himself and his deceased father the victims of my love." Lisa appeared in the same segment, her face a mask of sorrowful support. "Mark has been incredibly patient with our mother," she said. "He sacrificed his own peace of mind to ensure she gets proper care, and now she's repaying his kindness with these awful accusations. I stand behind my brother completely." The media coverage was overwhelming. Medical experts were brought in to discuss paranoid delusions in elderly stroke patients. Legal analysts explained how families could protect themselves from false accusations by mentally ill relatives. Church leaders, people who should have remembered my years of faithful service, discussed the tragic case of a woman whose illness had destroyed her relationship with her loving family. But in the midst of this media storm, something unexpected happened. Eleanor Patterson, my former assistant choir director, who'd been quietly supporting me, was watching the coverage from her home. She'd known me for over 20 years, had worked with me through countless challenges, and she recognized something that others missed: the systematic nature of my destruction. Eleanor contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a digital forensics expert who specialized in detecting manipulated media. Together, they brought in a retired social worker who'd investigated elder abuse cases for decades. Within days, they had irrefutable proof that Brenda's video had been altered. The audio analysis showed clear signs of editing. The visual examination revealed digital manipulation, and the metadata proved that the video had been processed through sophisticated editing software. Eleanor also expanded her investigation into Mark and Brenda's financial dealings, uncovering a pattern of exploitation that extended beyond my case. Bank records, property transfers, and testimony from other church members painted a picture of a couple who'd been systematically looting resources while positioning themselves as pillars of the community. But I didn't know about Eleanor's investigation yet. From my hospital bed, I watched my life's work, my reputation, and my final plea for justice being twisted into a weapon against me. I saw my grandson publicly disavow me, my daughter stand against me, and my son profit from my destruction. The nurse who'd helped me record the original message was suspended for violating patient privacy policies. The few staff members who'd shown me kindness were reassigned to different departments. I was more isolated than ever, surrounded by people who saw me as the delusional woman from the viral video. But as I lay there watching my reputation burn in the court of public opinion, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: perfect, terrible clarity. The fog of gaslighting was lifting. The confusion was clearing, and I could see the situation with the kind of understanding that only comes from hitting absolute bottom. Mark hadn't just returned to destroy me financially. He'd come to finish what his father's secrets had started, the complete annihilation of anyone who might hold him accountable for his choices. He'd used my own love as his weapon, my own family as his shields, my own voice as his ammunition. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his perfect plan. He'd forgotten that I was Barbara Williams' church choir director, and I'd spent 40 years learning to recognize and correct exactly this kind of systematic discord. The symphony wasn't over. The final movement was about to begin, and this time I would be conducting with the full power of truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Patterson, my former assistant choir director, who'd been quietly investigating my case, discovered that I had a small emergency savings account I'd completely forgotten about, money I'd set aside years ago for unexpected medical expenses. It contained just enough to fund the legal battle of my lifetime. Barbara. Eleanor said, visiting me in the hospital, "We're going to fight this with everything we have. I've assembled a team, and we're going to expose what they've done to you." Within weeks, I had a legal team that Mark and Brenda never saw coming. Judge Catherine Morrison, a retired probate judge who specialized in elder abuse cases. Sarah Chen, a former social worker who'd investigated family fraud for decades. And Eleanor herself, bringing credibility and documentation that would transform our case from a family dispute into a federal investigation. "We're not just fighting for your money," Judge Morrison explained during our first strategy meeting. "We're fighting for every elderly person who's been victimized by their own family. This case is going to set precedents." The federal civil and criminal lawsuit we filed was comprehensive and devastating. Mark and Brenda were charged with elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential prison sentences and financial penalties that would destroy them as completely as they destroyed me. The media attention was immediate and intense. The case had everything journalists loved: family betrayal, viral videos, stolen money, and a victim who'd fought back against impossible odds. Court TV announced they would broadcast the proceedings live, and legal experts began analyzing the case on national television. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when the trial began. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his usual confidence visibly shaken by the magnitude of the charges against him. Brenda sat beside him no longer, the composed manipulator, but a frightened woman facing federal prison. Lisa sat in the gallery, her face pale with the realization of what she'd helped enable. Eleanor took the stand, first her presentation, methodical and devastating. She'd spent months analyzing every financial transaction, every legal document, every piece of evidence related to the systematic destruction of my life. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, her voice calm and professional. Mark and Brenda Williams orchestrated a systematic campaign of elder abuse designed to isolate Barbara Williams from her support network, steal her assets, and destroy her reputation when she tried to resist. But the most damaging evidence came next. Eleanor played the unedited audio recordings from my hidden voice recorder, the conversations Mark and Brenda thought no one else would ever hear. Mark's voice filled the courtroom, cold and dismissive. "This is on her. She's losing her mind. We're busy with our careers, our own families. Don't expect us to drop everything. It's time she moved on. It's your burden now. You have no humanity left for our lives." The jury listened in stunned silence as Mark's callous disregard for my suffering played out in real time. But then Eleanor played the second recording captured during one of their planning sessions. Brenda's voice was calculating and cruel. "The old lady is costing us a fortune. All this caring is just an excuse for her to demand our time and attention. She's a burden we need to shed. Once her house is sold, we're free. $400,000 will cover the cheapest facility we can find, and whatever's left over, well, Mark deserves compensation for all the stress she's caused." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The jury looked horrified. Even the judge appeared shaken by the casual cruelty in their voices. Judge Williams, presiding over the case, delivered a scathing condemnation that would be quoted in legal textbooks for years to come. "I have presided over thousands of cases in my career," he said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "but I have never encountered such a monstrous display of ingratitude and shocking lack of humanity. The defendants have taken the sacred trust of family relationships and weaponized it for personal gain. Their actions are beyond reprehensible." When Mark was called to testify, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble immediately. Confronted with the audio evidence, the financial records, and the testimony of expert witnesses, he tried to maintain his victim narrative. "I was trying to help her," he said, his voice shaking. "She was becoming confused, making poor decisions. Someone had to take responsibility for her care." But as the recordings played again, as the scope of his deception became clear, something inside Mark broke completely. He began to weep, then to shake, then to become incoherent. "I never meant for it to go this far," he sobbed. "I just wanted her to be safe. But she kept fighting us, kept questioning everything, and I got so angry. I lost sight of who she was, what she meant to me. I turned my own mother into my enemy." The transformation was complete. The manipulative predator who destroyed my life was reduced to a broken crying figure on the witness stand. I felt no satisfaction in his collapse, only a profound sadness for the boy I'd raised and the man he'd chosen to become. Brenda's reaction was swift and desperate. She tried to flee the courtroom when she realized the case was lost, but court officers apprehended her before she could escape. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled into desperation and tears. "This is all Mark's fault," she screamed as they restrained her. "He planned everything. I was just trying to support. My husband, Barbara, is vindictive. She's trying to destroy our family." But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The digital manipulation of my video, the systematic destruction of my reputation, the orchestrated campaign of isolation, all of it traced back to her planning and execution. Mr. Jenkins, the social services investigator who'd become complicit in their scheme, was facing his own reckoning. His participation in the fraud had been exposed, his professional license was being revoked, and he was facing criminal charges of his own. The most heartbreaking moment came when I looked at Lisa. My daughter sat in the gallery, tears streaming down her face, as she listened to the evidence of her complicity. When the recordings of her dismissive phone calls played, when her cruel comments about my dramatic behavior were broadcast to the world, she broke down completely. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with a remorse so deep it was almost unbearable to witness. She mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," over and over, but she didn't approach me. She knew as I knew that the chasm between us was too wide to bridge with simple apologies. As the trial concluded, I sat in stunned silence. The truth was finally out. The lies had been exposed. The manipulation had been revealed. But victory felt hollow when it came at such a devastating cost to my family. The boy I'd raised as my son, the man I'd sacrificed my career to save, was facing federal prison. The daughter I'd protected from scandal was publicly disgraced. The grandchildren I'd loved were traumatized by the truth of what their parents had done. But as painful as the legal victory was, I knew the real work was just beginning. Healing from this betrayal, rebuilding my life, finding a way to move forward. That would be the true test of my strength. The gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the packed courtroom like the final note of a symphony. Judge Williams' voice was firm and unwavering as he delivered the verdict that would change all our lives forever. The court finds Mark Williams and Brenda Williams guilty of criminal elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Mark Williams is sentenced to 10 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. Brenda Williams is sentenced to 7 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 3 years. Mark's face went white. 10 years. At 45 years old, he'd spend the next decade of his life behind bars for what he'd done to his own mother. Brenda collapsed into her chair, the weight of her sentence crushing her completely. The court also orders full restitution of the stolen funds, plus punitive damages totaling $500,000. Additionally, all property obtained through fraudulent means must be returned to the plaintiff immediately. The judge wasn't finished. He turned to address the packed courtroom, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that would be remembered long after the trial ended. This case represents one of the most systematic and cruel examples of elder abuse this court has ever seen. Barbara Williams, a respected church choir director who dedicated her life to serving others, was victimized by the very people who should have protected her. Her character has been vindicated, her reputation restored, and her dignity reclaimed. The words washed over me like a healing balm. After months of being called delusional, paranoid, and mentally unstable, the highest court in the land had declared me not just innocent, but victimized. My professional reputation, my life's work, my identity, all of it was restored in that moment. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, this court formally recognizes Mrs. Williams's lifelong integrity as a church choir director and condemns the systematic psychological manipulation of her grandchildren. The false narrative of her mental instability is hereby dismantled and rejected. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. The case had captured national attention, and the verdicts were being analyzed on every major news program. Legal experts called it a landmark case for elder abuse prevention. Church leaders hailed it as a victory for vulnerable seniors everywhere. But the personal reckonings were more complex than the legal ones. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter from Mark in prison. His handwriting was shaky, his words desperate and rambling. "Mom," he wrote, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm begging you anyway. I'm broken financially and emotionally. I've lost everything. My freedom, my reputation, my family. I'm a middle-aged man in federal prison, and I'm scared." The letter went on for pages, alternating between self-pity and genuine remorse. He admitted to the systematic abuse he'd orchestrated, acknowledged the manipulation he'd used against me, and confessed to losing sight of who I was in his greed for financial gain. "I turned you into my enemy when you were the only person who ever truly loved me unconditionally," he wrote. "I used your sacrifices against you, twisted your love into a weapon. I can never undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt his own mother so cruelly." I read the letter once, then put it away. Mark's remorse, however genuine, couldn't undo the damage he'd caused. He would serve his sentence and perhaps find some peace in his remaining years, but our relationship was forever changed. Brenda's fate was different. Her letter was brief and bitter, blaming me for ruining her life and claiming she'd been manipulated by Mark into participating in the abuse. She showed no remorse, no understanding of what she'd done, no hope for redemption. Lisa's path was more complex. 2 months after the sentencing, she came to my restored home, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking with nervous energy. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she said, falling into my arms the moment I opened the door. "I was scared and I was weak, and I let them convince me that you were the problem. I chose the easy path instead of the right path, and I abandoned you when you needed me most." Lisa's remorse was deep and genuine. She'd spent weeks in therapy, working through her own guilt and understanding her role in the family dynamics that had nearly destroyed me. Her apologies came with concrete actions. She'd moved closer to my home, taken early retirement to spend time with me, and begun the process of rebuilding her life around our relationship. "I want to spend the rest of my life making this up to you," she said. "I want to be the daughter you deserved all along." The grandchildren's healing was the most heartbreaking of all. Ethan and Chloe, now 18 and 16, had been devastated by their parents' imprisonment and the revelation of the systematic abuse they'd unknowingly participated in. They'd spent months in therapy working through their own trauma and guilt. When they finally came to see me 6 months after the trial, they were different children than the ones who'd publicly disavowed me. They were quieter, more serious, marked by the knowledge of what their family had done. "Grandma," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I said terrible things to you. I wished you would die. I can't believe I said that to my own grandmother." "You were children," I replied, taking his hand. "You were manipulated by adults who should have protected you. You're not responsible for what they made you do." Chloe burst into tears. "We love you, Grandma. We always loved you, even when they were teaching us to hate you. We were just so confused." The process of rebuilding our relationship was slow and careful. The children needed time to process their trauma, to understand the adults who'd failed them, to learn to trust again. But gradually, over many months, we found our way back to each other. They began spending weekends with me, asking questions about their family history, learning about the grandmother they'd almost lost. They wanted to understand what had happened, how manipulation worked, how they could protect themselves and others from similar abuse. "You're our real family," Chloe said one evening as we sat on my porch. "Not the fake family they were trying to create with lies and money." My home was restored to me as part of the restitution, along with all my possessions that could be recovered. Walking through those rooms again, Seeing my music collection back where it belonged, sitting at my old piano for the first time in over a year, felt like coming back to life. But the victory was bittersweet. I'd reclaimed my money, my reputation, and my dignity, but the cost had been enormous. My family was fractured, probably forever. My son was in prison, my daughter-in-law had abandoned her children, and my grandchildren bore scars that would last a lifetime. Yet we were also free. Free from Mark's manipulation, free from the lies and deception that had poisoned our relationships, free to build something new and honest from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The trial had made me a public figure, a symbol of resilience and justice for elder abuse victims. Speaking requests poured in from across the country, and publishers were interested in my story. But more importantly, I'd found my purpose again. The pain I'd endured had given me a unique perspective on family manipulation and elder abuse. I could help others recognize the patterns, fight back against predators, and reclaim their lives. My voice, which had been silenced by institutional walls and legal manipulation, was finally free to sing again. The truth had set us all free, but freedom came with the responsibility to use it wisely. I was Barbara Williams, and I had work to do. 2 years after the trial, I stood in my kitchen making coffee, watching the morning light filter through the windows of my restored home. The house felt different now. Lighter, more peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from living authentically and having survived the worst. My health had improved dramatically once the stress of constant psychological warfare was removed. My blood pressure was under control, my weight had returned to normal, and the chronic pain that had plagued me during my darkest months was largely gone. I'd gained back my strength, my energy, and most importantly, my voice. The morning ritual of coffee and reflection had become sacred to me. It was my time to appreciate the simple pleasure of living in my own home, making my own choices, controlling my own life. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful, filled with the potential for music, laughter, and love. Lisa arrived at 9 o'clock as she did every morning. She'd moved into a small house just around the corner, and we'd developed a routine that brought both of us deep joy. She'd help me with household tasks, we'd work in the garden together, and in the evenings we'd sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. "How did you sleep, Mom?" she asked, kissing my cheek as she entered the kitchen. "Like a baby," I replied, and I meant it. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without fear, without nightmares, without the constant vigilance that had defined my life during the abuse. Our relationship had transformed into something deeper and more authentic than it had ever been. Lisa's guilt over her past behavior had motivated her to become the daughter I'd always hoped she would be. But more than that, she'd become my closest friend and confidant. "The church called," she said, settling into her chair with coffee. "They want to know if you'd consider directing the Christmas choir again." I smiled, thinking about the invitation that had arrived the previous week. The church board had formally apologized for their treatment of me, restored my pension, and asked me to return to the position I'd held for over 20 years. But more than that, they'd asked me to help them understand how to recognize and prevent the kind of abuse I'd suffered. "I think I'm ready," I said. "It would be good to make music again." After finishing my coffee with Lisa, I walked out to my garden. The morning glories were in full bloom, climbing up the trellis I'd rebuilt after moving back into my home. They'd become a symbol of renewal for me, proof that even after the harshest winters, beauty could return stronger than before. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, broken and defeated, convinced that her life was over. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I was living now, the purpose I'd found, the peace I'd discovered. My phone buzzed with a text message from Eleanor, now my closest collaborator in the work that had become my passion. Barbara. Her message read, 60 Minutes wants to do a segment on elder abuse prevention. They want you to be the primary interview. Your story is changing how people think about family dynamics and aging. My story had become a powerful tool for education and prevention. The trial had been widely covered, and the case had become a landmark in elder abuse law. But more importantly, it had given me a platform to help others recognize and fight back against similar abuse. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor, Ethan, now 20, and a junior in college studying social work. He'd been inspired by our family's experience to pursue a career helping others navigate family dysfunction and abuse. Grandma, he said, settling into the chair beside me on the porch, I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been asked to speak at a conference about the impact of family manipulation on young people. I looked at my grandson, this thoughtful young man, who'd grown from the traumatized boy who'd once wished for my death. His journey had been remarkable, transforming his pain into purpose, his experience into expertise. I want to tell our story, he continued. I want other kids to understand how adults can manipulate them, how they can be used as weapons against people they love. I want to help prevent what happened to our family. I think that's wonderful, I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. Your voice, your perspective could help so many people. Chloe joined us for dinner, now 18, and about to start college herself. She'd chosen to study music therapy, determined to use the healing power of music to help others the way it had helped our family recover. I got the scholarship, she announced with pride. Full ride to study music therapy. I want to work with families who've experienced trauma, help them find their voices again. As we sat around my dinner table, Lisa, Ethan, Chloe, and myself, I marveled at how we'd rebuilt our family from the ashes of Mark's destruction. We were smaller now, missing the members who'd chosen greed over love, but we were stronger, more honest, more genuine than we'd ever been. Mark's letters had become less frequent over the past year. His most recent one showed genuine growth and understanding, but also acceptance that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt completely. He was learning to live with the consequences of his choices, finding purpose in helping other inmates overcome addiction and family dysfunction. I don't expect forgiveness, he'd written. I just want you to know that I'm trying to become worthy of the love you once gave me. I'd replied briefly, wishing him well and expressing hope for his continued healing. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely, but I could offer him the gift of my forgiveness, even if I couldn't offer him my trust. That evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the sunset, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey I'd taken. The pain had been enormous, the losses devastating, but the growth had been equally profound. I'd discovered strengths I never knew. I had found purpose in my suffering and learned to trust my own voice again. I was Barbara Williams' church choir director, elder abuse survivor, and advocate for justice. I was 68 years old, and I was just getting started. My life had been reclaimed, my voice had been freed, and my legacy would be one of courage, resilience, and hope. The woman who'd once been silenced by institutional walls had become a beacon of strength for others. The victim had become a victor. The ending had become a beginning. My symphony was complete, but the music would continue for generations to come. 4 years have passed since that terrible day when I was forced from my home and into institutional silence. As I write these words, sitting in my sunlit music room with a cup of coffee and tomorrow's choir practice music spread across my piano, I can barely recognize the broken woman I once was. My home is alive with love again. Lisa visits daily, bringing deep conversations and genuine affection that heal old wounds. Ethan and Chloe spend weekends here, sharing their dreams and seeking wisdom from the grandmother they almost lost. Our family dinners are smaller than they once were, but they're built on truth and authentic love rather than manipulation and fear. I've become something I never expected, a national voice for elder abuse, prevention, and family healing. My memoir has touched hundreds of thousands of lives, and my work with law enforcement and social services has led to new protections for vulnerable seniors. Every day I receive letters from people who found the courage to speak up, to fight back, to reclaim their dignity because they heard my story. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayal. Lisa and I have built a relationship stronger than we ever had before, forged in the fires of honesty and tempered by genuine love. My grandchildren have grown into remarkable young adults determined to use their experience to help others. Even Mark, scarred but genuinely changed, has found his way to a different kind of redemption. The greatest lesson I've learned is that our voices cannot be silenced by others. They can only be surrendered by ourselves. I learned that true family is built on respect and honesty, not control and convenience. I discovered that it's never too late to fight back, to reclaim your life, to find your harmony again. To anyone listening who feels trapped by family members who claim to love you while betraying you, trust your instincts. Your feelings are valid. Your voice matters. Your dignity is worth fighting for. It is never too late to stand up for yourself, to speak your truth, to demand the respect you deserve. I am Barbara Williams. I am 68 years old. I am a church choir director, a mother, a grandmother, and a survivor. My life is my own. My choices are my own, and my legacy is one of courage, resilience, and hope. The darkness tried to silence my voice, but I chose to sing louder instead. And in that choice, I found not just survival, but a life of profound meaning and authentic joy.